Gene Clark, born as Harold Eugene Gene Clark in Tipton, Missouri on November 17, 1944. The world he entered was humble, a rural Midwestern life far from the booming coasts that would become the epicenters of musical transformation in the 1960s. His father, who worked for the local railroad, brought home a guitar one day when Gene was still very young, and that simple gift unleashed something extraordinary. Gene taught himself chords in a matter of weeks, demonstrating an almost eerie natural gift for melody. He'd sing at family gatherings, sometimes trembling with a nervous energy he could never fully shake. But the power in his voice was unmistakable. It could sway between a soft vulnerability and an otherworldly resonance that made listeners feel he was singing directly to them. In the late 1950s, American music was a patchwork of early rock and roll, doo-wop country ballads, and the first flickers of what we'd later call folk revival. Buddy Holly had recently lit the scene on fire with his geek chic persona, and the Everly Brothers were topping charts with their honeyed harmonies. Meanwhile, hidden in pockets of small-town bars and coffee shops, folk purists kept the flame of acoustic music burning. For young Gene, these influences wove themselves seamlessly into his mind. From the beginnings, he was drawn to the soulful honesty of country music, the shimmering harmonies of early rock, and the storytelling tradition of folk. Even at 15, he was trying to blend all these forms into a single, cohesive style. The people around him, family members, a few local kids who jammed with him, noticed that Gene wasn't interested in simply imitating the hits of the day. He was writing new music almost compulsively, filling notebooks with half-finished lyrics and chord progressions. It was as though the floodgates had opened and he couldn't stop the rush. Gene's first taste of real exposure came with a local band called the Rum Runners. Barely out of his teens, he was performing in Midwest clubs, learning how to read a crowd, how to keep the energy up. Though he enjoyed the thrill of being on stage, something in him always bristled under the spotlight. A subtle anxiety, a sense of awkwardness, haunted him. He could handle smaller venues where he still felt connected to the audience, but the bigger the stage, the more he wanted to shrink away. This tension between a man bursting with songs and a man terrified of public scrutiny would become one of the central contradictions of his entire life. He ended up joining the New Christie Minstrels for a short stint. They were a squeaky clean folk ensemble, popular in mainstream circles, but not exactly known for pushing boundaries. Gene, with his restlessness and desire for fresh sounds, quickly felt stifled. It was on a trip to California that everything changed. He heard the early music of Bob Dylan, a raspy voice that seemed to fling raw poetry at the world. Dylan wasn't trying to stay inside any neat lines or please the elders of the folk scene. He was twisting and bending words, forcing them to speak urgent truths about politics, love, protest, and personal reflection. This lit a fire in Gene. He realized that folk could be more than pristine harmonies. It could be edgy, rebellious, and full of electricity. In 1964, Gene found himself in Los Angeles, a restless 20-year-old hoping to chase something intangible, a new kind of music that was forming in his head but not yet on the radio. He crossed paths with Jim McGuinn, soon to be Roger McGuinn, in a chance meeting at the Troubadour, the legendary music club that was a magnet for innovative souls. They discovered a mutual love for the Beatles as well as Dylan's music, and those two pillars, British invasion exuberance and folks' lyrical depth, would become the bedrock of the Byrds. Chris Hillman and David Crosby entered the picture, along with Michael Clarke on drums. Thus, the Byrds were born. Although each member would become iconic in their own right, in the earliest days, Gene Clark was the band's primary songwriter and arguably its guiding creative force. The magic was instantaneous. At Ciro's, a trendy nightclub on the Sunset Strip, the Byrds tested their mix of jangly 12-string guitars and choral folk harmonies. Audiences were stunned. The band felt unstoppable. When they released their cover of Bob Dylan's Mr. Tambourine Man in 1965, it soared to the top of the charts, pioneering the distinct folk rock sound that fused melodic pop with protest roots. The press lauded them as the American Beatles, a group that might match the British wave blow for blow. But behind the scenes, Gene was already wrestling with demons. His stage fright was intensifying, and a new tension was brewing within the band. Gene's songwriting was the lifeblood that gave the Byrds their distinct flavor. Yet Roger McGuinn's distinctive 12-string guitar riffs were capturing fan attention. David Crosby, brash and flamboyant, was stepping into the spotlight. Gene, the quieter presence, felt overshadowed. Meanwhile, the demands of touring, the long hours, the screaming fans, and the general mania of mid-60s pop stardom collided with his anxious nature. He drank to steady his nerves, began taking pills to cope with the pressure, and found it increasingly difficult to be on for interviews and photo shoots. One of the lesser-known stories from this time involves Gene's profound fear of flying, particularly ironic for a member of a band called the Byrds. With each flight to another city, his heart would race uncontrollably. Rumor has it he sometimes locked himself in the airplane bathroom, trembling, while the rest of the band rolled their eyes, or, in gentler moments, tried to console him. David Crosby later mentioned in an interview that Gene was the best songwriter among us. Yet he was also the one who seemed least equipped for the rigors of constant touring. This friction led to arguments about travel schedules, about how the Byrds should handle press, and about songwriting credits. Gene felt his contributions weren't being fully recognized. He had penned some of the band's standout original tracks, songs that soared with emotional nuance, bridging the gap between folk balladry and pop structure. Yet critics often singled out McGuinn's guitar as the main feature. The culmination of these tensions led Gene to walk away. He quit the Byrds in 1966 after having co-written the band's next ambitious single, 8 Miles High. That track would become a landmark in psychedelic rock, known for its swirling soundscapes and avant-garde style. But in the official record, the credit was shared among Gene, McGuinn, and Crosby. Many insiders believe Gene was the principal architect of the piece. To him, it was a heartbreak, creating something so revolutionary only to step away before reaping its full artistic recognition. He was just 21 years old, burdened with anxieties and resentments, yet brimming with songs he'd never get to fully test with the Byrds. He said goodbye, carrying with him the anguish of unfulfilled camaraderie and the blossoming seeds of a solo career that would captivate a devoted few, but remain largely under the radar. He tried to reset, moving back to his family's place for a while, hoping to find a calm center. That interlude was short-lived. The call of music was too strong, and L.A. was still the epicenter of the new wave of rock and folk. Gene inked a deal with Columbia Records for a solo project. His first solo effort, Gene Clark with the Gosden Brothers, released in 1967, was an exquisite tapestry of country-tinged folk rock, featuring bright harmonies from Vern and Rex Gosden. Critics who bothered to listen were favorable, praising its melodic beauty, but it was overshadowed by the Byrds' own new album released around the same time, and radio stations gave it minimal rotation. Gene was crushed. The sense of being overshadowed by his former band was something he couldn't shake. As the late 1960s bled into the 1970s, the cultural landscape was changing. Psychedelia was giving way to a deeper, more introspective style of rock, and singer-songwriters were stepping forward with personal confessions. James Taylor, Carole King, and Joni Mitchell were forging a path that emphasized vulnerability and poetic introspection. Gene should have been at the forefront of that wave. His songwriting was as honest and intimately revealing as anyone's. But self-sabotage played a nasty role. He wavered constantly. One day he'd be fired up about the new tracks he was writing. The next day he'd be in a debilitating fog of depression, ingesting heavy amounts of alcohol just to make it through the night. Despite these setbacks, he joined forces with Doug Dillard, a banjo virtuoso from the Dillards, and formed Dillard and Clark, releasing 2 albums. The Fantastic Expedition of Dillard and Clark, 1968, and Through the Morning, Through the Night, 1969. The first was a near masterpiece, a forward-thinking blend of country, bluegrass, folk, and rock that many now recognize as a cornerstone of the country rock genre. Musicians in Laurel Canyon circles, bands like the Eagles and Poco, quietly admired it, sometimes even pilfering ideas, but in a mainstream sense it hardly made a ripple. There was little promotional push, and Gene, never comfortable with aggressive self-promotion, let it slip away. During sessions for the second Dillard and Clark album, tensions rose again. Gene's personal troubles and the pressure to replicate some measure of commercial success caused frictions in the studio. Eventually, Gene left that outfit too. His downward slide accelerated. Periods of heavy drinking became common. At times, he'd vanish from the scene, retreating to some rented room or a small family place, trying to piece himself together again. People who encountered him in those intervals describe a sensitive, introspective man who could be mesmerizing in a one-on-one conversation. He loved discussing poetry, older blues records, existential philosophy, but if a stranger recognized him as the guy from the Byrds, he'd clam up or deflect. In 1971, a flicker of hope emerged. Gene struck a deal with A&M Records and began work on what would become White Light, often cited by fans as one of his finest achievements. The album displayed a more acoustic, introspective side, reminiscent of the confessional singer-songwriter wave that was then dominating certain circles in LA. White Light was well reviewed in England and garnered some positive notes in the States, but again it slipped through the cracks commercially. Gene's face wasn't well known and the label didn't prioritize promotion. To compound matters, Gene still dealt with intense stage fright, making tours inconsistent and overshadowed by his own nerves. One night, after a poorly attended gig at a small club, Gene reportedly broke down backstage, muttering, "They don't care about my songs, they never did," while a couple of close friends tried to console him. Yet the songs kept coming. For Gene, writing was survival. In early interviews, he confided that songwriting was both a balm and a torment. He had to chase melodies and words that came uninvited, but then was too emotionally raw to perform them. Perhaps the most ambitious statement of his entire solo career arrived in 1974. The album No Other, recorded for Asylum Records, with a robust budget that allowed Gene to experiment with lush orchestrations, gospel choirs, and layered production. The result was a grand evocative tapestry weaving spiritual longing, heartbreak, and cosmic wonder. But when it was presented to the label executives, they balked. The record was expensive, and it didn't yield an obvious radio-friendly single. Asylum slashed promotional efforts. Critics gave it mixed reviews at best, and it was relegated once again to the status of a cult classic. In time, No Other would gain a reverential following among certain circles. Fleet Foxes, Beach House, and other modern artists cite it as a key influence. But back then, it was just another heartbreak for Gene. He was crushed, feeling that he'd poured his entire soul into those recordings only to have them unceremoniously shelved. By the mid-1970s, the changing trends in music, disco's rise, arena rock's bombast, and the glam scene made Gene's introspective country folk rock fusion seem out of step. He found small pockets of fans in Europe where critics still praised his work with a sense of hushed admiration. But in America, a new generation of listeners had no idea who he was. Alcohol remained a constant companion, dulling the edge of a depression that had set in many years prior. Former bandmates occasionally reached out. Chris Hillman tried to coax him into short-lived reunion projects. There was a series of partial Byrds reunions, but they never led to a stable path. McGuinn went on to success leading the band under his own vision. Crosby had soared to mainstream glory with Crosby, Stills, Nash, and Young. Hillman and Graham Parsons had shaped the early alt-country scene. Gene was the odd man out, reduced to cameo appearances or minor tours that never quite captured the old spark. In interviews from that era, if the subject of his drinking came up, Gene would dodge it, sometimes with a self-deprecating joke. On other days, he'd be heartbreakingly candid, saying he felt invisible, that the same industry that had celebrated him at 20 had no use for him at 30. He tried to carry on, recording two sides to every story in 1977, a flawed but often lovely album that once again disappeared into the marketplace. By then, the press hardly bothered to send out more than a handful of reviews. That same year, he embarked on a promotional tour, but it was marred by no shows and inconsistent performances. Promoters complained about Gene's unreliability, and audiences grew smaller with every canceled date. The dream was slipping through his fingers like sand, and he was left with a gnawing sense of betrayal by the industry, by the band that had once been his family, perhaps even by fate. There were brief flashes of revival. In 1985, Gene joined a one-off reunion of the Byrds that also included Michael Clarke and John York. The idea was to keep the legacy alive, to ride the wave of nostalgia that had become a lucrative force. But the project was criticized by fans and critics for lacking the original lineup's core energy. Roger McGuinn, Chris Hillman, and David Crosby weren't involved. Gene ironically was overshadowed yet again, relegated to second billing by promoters more interested in McGuinn's name or in simply using Byrds as a marketing tool, even when the group on stage was missing vital components. Still, in some of those shows, Gene's voice, though older and a bit ragged, had moments of pure brilliance. Those who were there recall him singing certain lines with an ache so profound it felt like a confession, like he was finally, if painfully, revealing his soul to the crowd. He recorded with Carla Olson in the early 1980s, producing So Rebellious a Lover in 1987, which, in some small circles, gained traction as a late career highlight. The pair had a genuine rapport, and Carla tried to encourage him, to remind him that fans were out there who still cared. But by then, Gene's health was deteriorating. Years of substance abuse, coupled with anxiety and a near-constant sense of being cast aside, left him physically and emotionally fragile. He was hospitalized a few times, once for pancreatitis, and his weight fluctuated dramatically. Friends worried about him, but Gene had become adept at disappearing. He'd show up for a recording session or a random bar gig, play a few songs, then vanish. There's a poignant anecdote from around 1990. Gene took a late-night drive to the Old Troubadour in West Hollywood, that iconic club where so many of his early hopes had sprung to life. It was almost closing time. He slipped in quietly, listened to a local band finishing their set, and drank a solitary whiskey in the back corner. Hardly anyone recognized him. Someone asked, "Aren't you that guy from—" But the conversation ended there as Gene nodded and turned away, unwilling to elaborate. A couple of people that night recall seeing him exit just as the staff was locking up. He strolled along the pavement, glancing up at the marquee, as if remembering the days when lines had formed around the block to see the Byrds. Then he disappeared into the darkness. The end came quietly on May 24th, 1991. He was staying in a modest rental in Sherman Oaks, trying to nurse himself back to health after another decline. A friend came by that morning to check on him, found Gene slumped in that armchair, and dialed 911. He was pronounced dead shortly thereafter. Officially, it was listed as complications from a bleeding ulcer. Some accounts say it was aggravated by years of substance misuse and an overall weakened constitution. The few who read about it in the papers saw a short obituary. Gene Clark, 46, a former member of the Byrds, died. No major tributes on television, no sensational headlines. He was just gone. Controversy lingered about how quickly the Byrds overshadowed his memory. For instance, within a matter of years, the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame inducted the Byrds, celebrating their innovation in folk rock. Gene was included, of course, as a founding member, but the focus of the press and even the museum's materials often gravitated to McGuinn, Crosby, and Hillman. David Crosby, to his credit, did say in interviews that Gene's contributions were underappreciated, and Chris Hillman would occasionally champion Gene's importance. But the mainstream narrative had been set. The Byrds soared, thanks to Dylan covers and jangly guitars, and Gene Clark was a peripheral figure who left too soon. In retrospect, many fans and historians argue Gene was the heart of the band's earliest creative drive. He wrote or co-wrote many of their best songs, and his poetic instincts shaped their lyrical style. They point out that, had Gene stayed, he might have influenced the group's later ventures into psychedelia, country rock, and beyond. On the other hand, some people in the industry maintain that Gene's stage fright and substance problems were so severe that he would have stumbled under the weight of that level of fame. The truth probably lies somewhere in between. He was a fragile genius, built for studio craftsmanship rather than the grueling demands of touring and publicity. He needed the right environment and support, a place where his artistic spark could flourish without being choked by anxiety. Still, one can't ignore the sense of injustice that cloaks his legacy. He was the primary songwriter on 8 Miles High, a track that nearly every rock historian calls a watershed moment for psychedelic music. That alone should have sealed his name in rock's pantheon. Yet even at the band's Hall of Fame induction, that fact was seldom highlighted. It's only in more recent years, through documentaries, retrospective articles, and the devoted efforts of certain fans, that Gene's story has begun to resurface. People listen to No Other now and marvel at how ahead of its time it was, or they discover White Light and wonder why it wasn't lauded alongside Joni Mitchell's or Neil Young's best work. They hear the fantastic expedition of Dillard and Clark and detect the blueprint for the country rock movement that would explode with the Eagles, and they realize belatedly that Gene Clark was quietly sculpting an entire genre, even as he fought personal battles that left him close to the breaking point. Somewhere in the swirl of regrets and might-have-beens, there's a lesson about the cruel intersection of artistry and commerce. Gene was undoubtedly a visionary, but he lacked the pragmatic armor necessary to navigate an industry that demands relentless visibility, confident self-promotion, and an iron will. It's not that he was naive. He simply had a soul too tender for the machinery of pop stardom, and it ground him down. Friends recall him lamenting in his final months that people would only recognize his music once I'm 6 feet under, a statement that turned out to be a grim prophecy. In the years since his passing, new generations of musicians and aficionados have unearthed his catalog, championing him as the quintessential great lost songwriter of the 20th century. Listening to the haunting track Spanish Guitar from White Light can bring tears to modern listeners who stumble upon it by chance on a streaming service. His voice, at once crystalline and full of yearning, draws you into a timeless space. You sense the sincerity behind every line. No artifice, no vanity, just an unwavering emotional truth. That sincerity is what continues to haunt those who discover him. They hear the heartbreak and realize it's not a performance. It's a man unraveling, trying to wrest beauty from the chaos in his head. Gene Clark's story is, at its core, about the fragility of visionaries in a world that prizes spectacle. Over the decades, tribute concerts have been held in small clubs where contemporary artists gather to sing his songs, from Here Without You to In a Misty Morning. Younger fans come out of curiosity, older fans show up out of reverence. Sometimes these events end with a hush, the entire room caught in the gravitational pull of Gene's melodies, understanding, perhaps for the first time, how vast a legacy he left behind. It's not a legacy measured by chart positions or lavish award ceremonies, but by the quiet, life-altering resonance of songs that refuse to die. That resonance also calls forth a broader human truth. Not all creators are built for the limelight, and not all contributions get properly recognized in their time. There's a special kind of tragedy in lighting the torch for a movement yet not getting to march in the parade. Gene Clark's life illustrates how easily the music industry can devour the timid or the deeply sensitive, how the roar of applause can be just as terrifying as it is gratifying. It shows how fragile an artist's psyche can be, especially when inundated with commercial pressures and overshadowed by louder personalities. And it reminds us that sometimes the most influential figures are those who slip through the cracks of immediate fame. That's a wrap for today's video. If you enjoyed it, smash that like button, drop us a comment below, and don't forget to subscribe so you'll never miss our new content. Thanks for watching.